So, you might have noticed that Bubsy is making a comeback pretty soon, I think like September or something, and that's pretty bad considering the quality of his previous games, but personally, I believe that everyone deserves a second chance. You know, it could be worth a laugh or two. The idea of retreading something that you know didn't go down well is kind of like suicide. It's slipping on the same banana skin, it's the fly smacking its head against the same window for 10 minutes. There's a line about doing the same thing over and over again being a pretty crazy thing to do. But while I reckon that remaking a truly terrible video game is maybe the worst idea in the world, which is one that plenty people agree with since Superman 64 Reloaded remains a pipe dream, some games are worth saving. The games that disappoint me the most are the ones that surround a good idea or premise in waves and layers of absolute shit. And that's a little depressing because somebody put some effort into some part of this game, but then everyone else was like, nah, me and Brian are trying to throw ring donuts on each other's penises. I'm convinced this is how Concept spent the Kickstarter money, and if that's true, I'd probably respect Mighty No. 9 a bit more because ring toss is hard. $40 million buys you a lot of food. Certain types of games work really well on handhelds, and the only common thread I can see is that most of the time the successful ones tend to be more arcade-like. It's being able to pick up and play a game while waiting for a bus, or while on an 8-hour flight, or while squeezing out a fresh one. And there's a particular type of game that really thrives here. It works inversely as well. While Tetris and Pokemon work really well on the go, it's a bit more of a stretch to sit down and play these games on a TV. Pokemon kicks ass on handheld, but is a little slower on console, which some see as a stumbling block behind games like Colosseum and the Stadium games. I kinda like it, but I'd be lying if I said that they were an improvement on the handheld games. But they also aren't bad games, so it doesn't really help me. Luckily, there's a game like this that is pretty horrible. The Pokemon Stadium games went down pretty well, despite being fairly simple games that allowed you to pit Pokemon against each other in 3 fucking dimensions. This was at a time when the sprites in the handheld games had only just started to move. Pokemon Battle Revolution aimed to pick this up 7 years later, but kind of forgot to include a lot of game. A game where you exclusively battle Pokemon was never going to be for everyone, especially since in Pokemon Battle Revolution that's literally all you can do since they took out the mini-games. Actually the best part of the Stadium games. But it is still surprising just how little content this game has to it. I mean, it looks nice, and I still love how the rain looks on the camera, but if you're looking for some video game to sink your teeth into, there's not a lot here. I remember the Wi-Fi options being fairly limited, but that was back in the day when Nintendo didn't really understand online gaming. Nowadays, I'd say they kind of do, and since the Switch is portable and awesome, I reckon that a remake would actually work really well. Honestly, it could be a new game for all I care, but Battle Revolution is the last game with this kind of outlook on Pokemon battling, so it makes for a good starting point. These days, people take Pokemon battles very seriously, and I think with some structure to the Wi-Fi, like tournaments or leaderboards, maybe different leagues for players of different skill, Nintendo would have an awesome high-resolution way for people to battle with Pokemon. Keep it cheap though, because I'm not sure this focus on multiplayer would warrant a full-price release. Think about it, come back to me, and agree with me. Remakes are especially handy at fixing old problems in ancient video games. It's an effective way of bringing a classic game into the modern day through updating dated mechanics and interfaces, and as long as you approach remakes in this way, you're gonna have a lovely time. You give a game that hasn't aged well a new coat of paint, and wham, it's maybe sort of good as new. Earthbound and Mother 3, probably down to being quirky RPGs that keep the important stuff very simple, have aged kind of well, all things considered. Not the marketing though. Earthbound sold horribly in the US, almost entirely down to a campaign that went with, "Look at all of this, ain't it nasty?" It's not far off of "Don't play this game, it stinks." Ah, there you go. What a weird idea. Now, with the first Mother game, this marketing would have been appropriate because it's terrible. Mother or Earthbound, 2 words, not one, or maybe Earthbound 0. Earthbound Beginnings can be summed up as Earthbound but much simpler. It's still got the clever writing and the modern setting and every other enemy being something or someone you'd find in the suburbs, but the difference here is that Earthbound Beginnings, it's what Nintendo called it when they re-released it on the Wii U's Virtual Console 2 years ago, this game came out in 1989 at a time when RPGs were scratching around, looking for a way to make their games feel longer. So, long boring dungeons, obtrusive battle mechanics, and more grinding than a nightclub. And this is all particularly annoying since this whole series functions as the anti-RPG. You're not a knight working your way through a castle, you're a kid beating up crows and gang members. Though, with a bit of streamlining, maybe a graphical upgrade of sorts, you'd have the same type of enjoyable adventure that made Earthbound and Mother 3 so popular. That, and it may persuade Nintendo to remake Earthbound as well, or make a new game, or maybe just officially release Mother 3 in the West. Something tells me that people care about that. I think I remember people talking about Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival and how it has redeemable qualities because it's got a lot of charm to it, and that is correct, but the problem with that is that it eventually fades over time and you're left with the game behind it, and if the game has problems, you are going to notice. Earthbound Beginnings could be a really fun game, you just gotta make it less aggravating to play. It's an easy fix. You get the sense that certain developers don't really get why their games are or were popular. Game development itself isn't a simple process since it takes into account all sorts of changes in demographic and what kind of performance can be squeezed out of a console, but with a bit of internal reflection you can pinpoint what exactly worked so well in the last game. Castlevania is an unforgiving game where value for money is obtained through putting obstacles in your way that don't really like you, but it gives you just enough leeway that victory is tantalizingly possible. It's the kind of game that you learn to appreciate over time as you understand that everything from enemy placement to the color palette was done for a reason. It's also everything the sequel wasn't, so, you know, that's nice, I guess. I know what Castlevania needs. RPG elements, interactions with people who don't want to kill you, and all of the grinding in the world. That's what the first game was lacking, right? Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest isn't a bad game because it buckled under the pressure of succeeding a game as good as Castlevania 1. It's a bad game because it tries so hard to push against the player's innate sense of forward progression. Everything's a bit easier, but it's slower to compensate, which, you know, maybe works in an RPG, but this isn't an RPG. It's fucking Castlevania. You've got a whip that you can hit enemies with, but why is it so open-ended? Also, why is everything brown and grey? But the core gameplay of Castlevania is still there, it's just hidden behind a lot of problems. Honestly, I reckon Konami should remake the first two Castlevania games, since at least the first one hasn't aged all that badly at all, but could use a leg up to compete in today's market. The likelihood of that happening is minuscule though, since I doubt Konami could find time between missing the appeal of their classic franchises, making pachinko machines, and shooting themselves in the foot with a fucking anti-aircraft cannon. They're busy, I can understand that. There was a moment when I was watching the start of Microsoft's E3 2017 conference when they were talking about Minecraft in 4K for some reason, and I remember thinking to myself, wow, they are really out of touch, aren't they? And yeah, but they've been even further removed from reality before. I don't want to be the controller. If there's one thing I'm glad has been phased out of gaming over the course of the last 5 years, it's the focus on motion controls. Not necessarily a bad idea, but so many games implemented gyroscopes and motion detection in such a half-assed way, so every other game that used them well gets lost in the mire. Sitting atop a throne of fake immersion is the Xbox Kinect, which almost sounded like a good idea when Microsoft showed it off back in the day. They even gave it some cool games. Unfortunately, quite a lot of games cut corners, which you don't want to be doing with something that requires a lot of precision to work well. Especially in a high-speed racing game starring this guy. So the temptation is to say that Sonic 06 should be remade as soon as possible, but there's so much wrong with it! Even if someone actually coded it properly, you've still got one of the dumbest stories in video game history, and no amount of patches in the world will fix that. Honestly, you'd be changing so much that you might as well make a new game. Sonic Freeriders, though, is a horrible game where the controls sometimes work depending on how many animals you sacrifice that morning, and it's almost entirely down to the Kinect not being able to pick up your movements, or Sonic Freeriders being built by drooling morons, but it's not that bad. It looks pretty nice, the music is great like every other Sonic game, and if the stars aligned in the right way to make the controls function properly, the multiplayer was solid. So, you remake the game for a console that doesn't require you to leap around like a moron to turn corners, and give the player a goddamn controller instead. Maybe add some characters or freshen up the visuals a little bit. Really just anything that might let the game break through its outer layer of fucking awful controls. At what point when looking at a control stick did Microsoft say, you know what, I reckon we can beat that, leave it alone, that shit's magical. In the time I've spent writing about video games to make content for the YouTubes, I've found that it's very hard to talk about a game confidently if you have no first-hand experience of playing that game. It's the clear difference between looking at footage of a game and actually having a handful of controller. Often the way you react to various challenges that are placed in your path will teach you more about a game than by simply reading a review or browsing Wikipedia. Dark Souls, for example, is hard, but by playing it you find out that it presents its difficulty in simple terms before ramping it up over time. Except for the Bridge Dragon. That's just unfair. So Devil May Cry is fairly simple, right? You jump around, slash some bad guys, maybe shoot some of them, and Dante handles the rest. Especially in the third one, where the game is an aggressive arsehole, but Dante is charismatic enough to convince you to plow onwards. Dante wouldn't give up, why should I? The first and third games are pretty good, balancing harsh difficulty with varying degrees of fluid movement. The second one is actually terrible, and I think it comes down to those involved not understanding a thing about what worked in the first game. I know, why don't we make Devil May Cry really easy, make the guns do a ton of damage, which then makes the campaign feel incredibly short, while also making sure to increase the size of these areas so everything is really far apart. Also, if we could make Dante all brooding and as charismatic as a roll of toilet paper, that'd be cool as well. I think we're onto a winner here. I'll make a space in my trophy cabinet. So what do? Easy, you keep the same basic story because we want some continuity in this tale of pizza-loving demigods and giant talking spiders, but overhaul everything else. Everything must go. Make the game harder, faster, smaller, since open spaces only work if your game is an adventure game, which Devil May Cry definitely isn't. And for the love of all that is holy, someone give Dante a cuddle. Basically make it like Devil May Cry 3 and 4, rather than the kind of game you'd get if someone who hates you described Devil May Cry over the phone to you. If you can beat a Devil May Cry game inside 5 hours, you may have done something wrong. Maybe you did everything wrong. This is RabbidLuigi, and every game on here kind of walks the thin line of how reality works and how the companies who made these games kind of don't really care. But Devil May Cry is overdue a comeback more in line with the older games. This is the same Capcom who recently brought Resident Evil back from the brink, so I don't think it's that unlikely. Regardless, if and when they do make it, I hope they make it kind of hard, if just because reviews will start comparing it to Dark Souls. Because of course they will. Have you got an idea that you'd like me to turn to a countdown? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure you check out my Twitter, where I'll be turning the best submissions into a poll where you can then decide the best topic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.